Religious mother's secret affair with doctor leads to husband's brutal killing, true crime. Her fingers trembled as she dialed the number. The quiet hum of the phone made her heart race. She glanced over her shoulder, as if the walls might have ears. The house was empty, but it felt suffocating. She had promised herself she wouldn't do it again, but here she was. Her chest tightened as she listened to the ringing. Dr. Ellis. His smooth voice answered. "I can't stop thinking about you," she whispered, barely audible. There was a brief pause. Then he spoke, his tone low, seductive. "I know." Her breath hitched. She never expected it to go this far. But the secret meetings, the stolen moments, everything had spiraled beyond control. Her husband, Charles, never suspected a thing. He was always at work, always too busy. She had her own desires, though, and Dr. Ellis understood her in a way Charles never could. The thrill of the affair began to feel like an addiction. The hidden glances, the stolen kisses, and now the lies. "I want to see you again," she said, barely keeping her voice steady. Dr. Ellis responded quickly. "We need to be careful." She could almost hear the smirk in his voice. Careful? She wasn't sure she cared anymore. The once quiet, perfect life she led felt like a distant memory. The tension between them was unbearable. But they couldn't stop. She felt alive in his presence. Even the smallest touch sent a jolt through her. But this was dangerous. Very dangerous. Charles had grown suspicious lately. He had started asking questions. Where was she going? Why did she look so distant? The truth was buried deep, but she could feel the weight of it pressing down on her. The more she denied it, the more she felt trapped. And then it happened. One evening, Charles came home early. The front door slammed open. Her heart stopped. She quickly threw her phone onto the couch, hoping he wouldn't notice. But Charles wasn't fooled. His eyes narrowed as he scanned the room. "I know," he muttered. The air seemed to grow colder, thicker. "Where were you?" His voice was harsh, demanding. She swallowed hard, trying to steady her breathing. "I was at church," she lied. Charles didn't buy it. His eyes flashed with something dark, something dangerous. And that's when the silence grew deafening. A sudden knock at the door broke the tension. Her stomach churned. Who could it be at this hour? Charles walked toward the door without a word. His hands shook as he gripped the handle. The door creaked open, and then everything went black. The door swung wide. Charles froze. Standing in the doorway, face shadowed, was Dr. Ellis. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, a cold, thin smile curled on Ellis's lips. Charles didn't speak. He just stared. The tension was suffocating. "I need to talk to you, Charles," Dr. Ellis said, his voice smooth, calm, like everything was normal. Charles stepped back, his eyes flicking to his wife. She felt a surge of panic. Why was he here? What did he want? Dr. Ellis didn't wait for permission. He stepped inside. "I thought I made myself clear," Charles growled, his fists clenching. Dr. Ellis didn't flinch. His gaze remained fixed, almost too steady. "I'm here to end this," he said. There was something chilling in his voice. Her heart pounded in her chest. She had no idea how things had gotten this far. But this felt like the end. Her mind raced. What did he mean by end this? Charles took a step forward, his face red with anger. "What the hell is this?" He spat. Dr. Ellis didn't respond. Instead, he reached into his coat, slowly. Her breath caught in her throat. For a heartbeat, time seemed to freeze. Then, the sound of metal scraping against fabric. A gun. She didn't even have time to react. Before she could blink, the shot rang out. The echo of it rattled her bones. Charles collapsed to the floor with a sickening thud. The room went silent, except for the sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Dr. Ellis stood there, unmoving, his face expressionless. For a moment, everything felt surreal. Her hands trembled, her vision blurred. She couldn't speak. She couldn't move. She looked at her husband's body. The blood was spreading slowly, staining the carpet. It was too much to comprehend. The door slammed shut behind her. She didn't notice him leave. She couldn't look away from the scene before her. She had no idea what to do. Her body felt numb, cold, and in the midst of it all, she couldn't stop hearing Dr. Ellis's voice in her mind. It's over. It wasn't just the affair anymore. This was something else. Something darker. Her whole world was unraveling, and there was no going back. The consequences of her actions had come crashing down. In that silence, it was clear. Her life would never be the same. Her knees buckled beneath her. She stumbled back, hands pressed to her mouth, stifling a scream. Charles was dead. The room seemed to close in on her, suffocating her. Her thoughts were a mess, scattered like shards of glass. She had never expected this, never imagined it would end like this. She glanced at the body, then at Dr. Ellis. He stood there still. His expression hadn't changed. He was waiting. For what? For her to react? She felt the weight of his eyes, cold and calculating. Why? She whispered, her voice trembling. Dr. Ellis took a step toward her. His gaze softened, but it was still distant, detached. He wasn't the man you thought he was, he said, as if explaining a simple fact. He was always in the way. The words hit her like a slap. Was that it? Was that the reason for everything? Was that why he killed Charles? Her mind spun. She tried to process it all. The affair, the lies, the betrayal. None of it made sense now. What have we done? She muttered, more to herself than to him. You. He corrected her, his voice low, like a hiss. This was your choice, not mine. Her heart sank. She thought she had control over everything. But now there was no escaping it. There was no way back. Dr. Ellis was moving toward her again. The floor creaked under his weight, each step slow, deliberate. Now, he said, we can finally be together. She felt a chill crawl up her spine. This wasn't about love. It never had been. This was something darker. Something she couldn't escape. He reached out, his hand brushing her arm. Her skin prickled where he touched her, but she recoiled. No, she whispered, the word barely escaping her lips. But Dr. Ellis wasn't listening. He had already crossed the line. He'd crossed every line, and she had let him. But now she understood. Her pulse raced, fear surging through her veins. She had no way out, no way to fix what had been broken. In that moment, she realized the truth. There would be no happy ending for any of them. The affair wasn't just about passion. It was about control, power. And now it had come to this. A cold, empty room, a dead husband, and a future that seemed darker than the night outside. The sound of the gunshots still echoed in her mind, and the walls felt like they were closing in. Suddenly, she heard the distant sound of sirens. They were coming, but would they save her? Or had she already lost everything? The sirens grew louder, closer. She froze. For a split second, she thought about running, but where could she go? Her entire life had crumbled in a matter of minutes. Dr. Ellis didn't move. He was watching her, almost studying her, as if he knew exactly what she was thinking. Do you hear that? She whispered, her voice breaking. The sirens were relentless now, their wail cutting through the air like a blade. Dr. Ellis seemed unbothered. He didn't react. Instead, his lips parted into a thin, emotionless smile. You're mine now, he said softly. The words stung, colder than any of the guilt she felt. She had been a fool to think this would be anything other than this, dangerous, twisted, inevitable. Her breath caught in her throat. The weight of the situation pressed down on her chest. A storm of panic, regret, and disbelief flooded her thoughts. Charles was dead. Her husband, her life, gone. And now she was alone with the man who had turned it all into a nightmare. The door to the house banged open. She didn't look up, didn't dare. She could hear footsteps, more than one set. Her heart skipped. The police. They had arrived. But would they understand? Would they believe her? The pounding of feet grew louder as they entered the hallway. Dr. Ellis turned his back to her, almost casually, as if he didn't have a care in the world. A chill ran through her as she realized he wasn't worried about the police. She was the one who was exposed. She was the one in danger now. He had planned it all along. The affair, the manipulation, the murder. It was all part of his game. She opened her mouth to scream, to tell them everything, to beg for help. But no sound came out. Her throat was tight, paralyzed by fear. The officers were getting closer. They would find Charles soon. Would they arrest her? Would they see the truth? Or would they see her as just another guilty woman caught in the web of a love gone wrong? Before she could form another thought, Dr. Ellis turned sharply. His eyes locked on hers. And in that instant it hit her. It wasn't over. Not by a long shot. He was still in control. And he wasn't going to let her go. The police entered the living room, guns drawn. They froze. Their eyes darted between Dr. Ellis and her. She saw the confusion in their expressions. They couldn't make sense of it. And then in a split second, everything changed. Dr. Ellis reached into his coat again. The flash of metal caught the light. The officers shouted, but it was too late. The room erupted in chaos. Gunfire, screams, shouts. The air smelled of fear and blood. Through the haze, she could barely make out the scene unfolding around her. Dr. Ellis was moving, too fast, too cold. And she was still standing there, frozen in place, watching it all unfold. The police were scrambling now, but they couldn't contain him. He was too swift, too prepared. In the chaos, she could barely keep up. Everything was a blur of noise, panic and flashing lights. Then silence. For one brief moment, everything stopped. Dr. Ellis was gone. The officers were on the ground, their bodies sprawled in unnatural positions. The room, once filled with chaos, was now eerily quiet. And there she stood, alone, with her husband's blood still staining the floor, and the darkness closing in on her. She knew one thing for certain. She was never going to escape this. The silence was suffocating. She stood there, trembling, unable to move. Her heart hammered in her chest, but the world around her felt frozen. The sirens still wailed outside, but they seemed miles away. Her eyes flicked to the bodies of the officers, blood pooling on the floor. How had it all gone so wrong? How had she gone from a quiet, religious wife to this murderer's accomplice? She felt a wave of nausea rising in her throat. The air smelled metallic, heavy with blood. Her gaze shifted to Charles's lifeless body. She wanted to scream. She wanted to tear at her hair, to run, to hide, to do anything to erase this nightmare. But she couldn't. The room felt like a tomb, a cold, suffocating tomb. And then she heard it. Footsteps, soft but purposeful. She froze. The hair on the back of her neck stood up. Her eyes darted to the corner of the room. Dr. Ellis. He was standing there, watching her from the shadows. He was back. A wave of dread crashed over her. What now? What did he want from her? Hadn't he already taken everything? His face was pale, his eyes cold. His suit was splattered with blood, but he didn't seem to care. He looked almost serene, like this was all part of some grand plan. She tried to step back, but her legs were unsteady, as if they had lost the will to hold her. Don't, he said softly, almost tenderly. You can't run anymore. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. He stepped forward, slowly, deliberately. Every step he took felt like a countdown. Her heart thudded louder with each one. I did what needed to be done, he continued, his voice low and calm, as if discussing the weather. Charles was a weak man. He didn't deserve you. Her stomach twisted. Had he really said that? You deserve more, he added, his eyes narrowing slightly. She shook her head, frantic now. No, I didn't want this, she cried, her voice cracking. But Dr. Ellis wasn't listening. He reached out, gently cupping her face in his hand. His touch was cold, like the grave. We're not done yet, he whispered. There's more to be done, more that needs to be fixed. Her breath caught. She recoiled, but he was faster. His grip tightened on her chin, forcing her to meet his gaze. The world around her blurred. The sirens, the blood, the bodies. Everything seemed distant now, fading into the background. All she could focus on was his face, his cold, unwavering stare. And then a soft voice, so quiet it was barely audible, broke through the madness. Please, help me, she whispered. It wasn't a plea for rescue. It wasn't a cry for forgiveness. It was a surrender to the man who had made her life a twisted, horrifying nightmare. His lips curled into a smile. Now, he said, voice thick with satisfaction, we can begin. Suddenly, everything shifted. The door slammed open again. This time, it wasn't the police. A man walked in, his face hidden behind a black mask. He stepped over the bodies, moving toward them with purpose. Dr. Ellis didn't even blink. The masked figure nodded toward him. Dr. Ellis gave a slight nod back, and without a word, the stranger moved toward the living room, taking up a position near the door. She didn't understand. She didn't know what was happening. Her head spun as the realization hit her like a punch in the gut. She had been nothing but a pawn all along. Dr. Ellis wasn't just after her. He had orchestrated all of this. Charles's death, the police ambush, everything. And now, she was tangled deeper than ever before. There was no escape. The door was closed. The world outside was a distant memory. And the man she had trusted, the man she had fallen into this chaos with, was the one holding all the strings. She was trapped. And this was just the beginning. Dr. Ellis's voice sliced through the thick silence again. We have much to do, my dear, he said, his tone almost affectionate. Much to clean up. She felt a chill spread through her. It was too late. She had crossed a line, and now there was no going back. The final trap had been set, and she was already caught. The room seemed to shrink around her. Dr. Ellis's words echoed in her ears, cold and final. Much to clean up. Her breath hitched in her throat. She looked around, searching for an escape, but there was none. The stranger in the mask stood motionless, like a statue, his eyes never leaving her. Dr. Ellis stepped back, his hand slipping into his coat pocket. He pulled out something small, a key. She stared at it, her pulse quickening. Was it for the door? Was it the key to her freedom? Her heart raced as she shifted her eyes back to the masked figure. The man remained silent, his face unreadable. The weight of the situation hit her all at once. She had always believed she was in control, that she could manage the affair, keep it hidden, keep it contained. But now, in the aftermath, she realized how wrong she had been. This wasn't just about infidelity. This was about power, his power over her, over everything. Dr. Ellis approached her again, his movements measured, almost predatory. She could hear her breath, shallow and frantic. He stood just inches away from her, close enough for her to feel the coldness radiating from him. His smile was thin, like a blade. "You're not leaving here, you know," he said softly, the words dripping with menace. "Not yet." The stranger in the corner shifted slightly, a hint of movement in his posture. Dr. Ellis didn't seem to notice, or care. He continued, as if he were lecturing her. "This is only the beginning. You'll come to understand, in time, that this is the way things were meant to be." Her mind raced. The air was thick with tension. She felt the walls closing in again. Her fingers curled into fists, but there was no strength in them, no power. She was a puppet, and Dr. Ellis was pulling the strings. "I'm not like Charles," she heard herself say, her voice shaky. "I won't be controlled." Dr. Ellis's expression softened for a fraction of a second, but the softness was brief, fleeting. A moment later, he was back to his usual cold, calculating self. "You never understood him," he said, his eyes narrowing. He was weak. He couldn't see what was needed. "But you're different. You understand." She shook her head, her throat tight with panic. "No," she whispered, the word barely audible. "I don't want this. I want out. I want to go home." But Dr. Ellis only smiled, a slow, sadistic curve of his lips. "There is no home for you now," he replied. "You made your choice the moment you let me into your life." She felt the weight of his words crushing her chest. Her entire existence had shifted in the blink of an eye. The life she had known, her family, her faith, her sanity, was slipping away like sand through her fingers. And now, she was trapped. She could feel the eyes of the masked man on her, as if he were waiting for her to make a move, to do something, anything. But there was nothing to do. Nothing left to try. "Don't," she said, almost pleading, her voice breaking. "Please, let me go." Dr. Ellis's eyes hardened. "There's no going back," he said, each word measured and final. His hand moved toward the key in his pocket again. She flinched, but he didn't use it. Not yet. Instead, he reached past her, taking hold of the doorframe, his fingers curling around the wood. "You'll understand soon enough," he said, his voice chilling. "The game is far from over." Her stomach twisted in fear. What game? What was he planning? She didn't have time to think. The masked figure moved swiftly now, crossing the room with alarming speed. Before she could react, he was standing next to Dr. Ellis, his hand reaching toward her. She recoiled instinctively, her breath catching in her throat. But Dr. Ellis's eyes met hers, cold and unblinking. "You're coming with us," he said, as though there was no other option. "There's no more running, no more choices." The masked man stepped closer. His hand grabbed her wrist. She could feel the coldness of his grip and the darkness in his eyes. Her chest tightened. She wanted to fight. She wanted to scream, but she didn't know where to go, what to do. Every escape route, every plan, every hope had been stolen from her. And now she was completely at their mercy. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, but the walls around her seemed to close in even tighter. Her mind screamed for her to fight, to escape. But in the end, she knew there was no fight left. She was already theirs, and she was about to be dragged even deeper into the abyss. The masked man's grip on her wrist tightened, dragging her toward the door. She stumbled, her legs unsteady beneath her. Every step felt like an eternity, each one a crushing reminder of how far she had fallen. She couldn't think, couldn't process. Her body was moving, but her mind was frozen, caught in a haze of disbelief. She had imagined this moment so many times, her escape, her freedom, but it had never looked like this. There was no hero to rescue her, no justice to save her from the nightmare she had created. Only him. Dr. Ellis was standing behind her now, silent, watching her every move. His calmness, His complete control over the situation made her stomach churn. He had orchestrated everything. Everything. Her affair. Her lies. Charles's murder. The police. The blood. The terror. All of it. A carefully planned game. And she had been a pawn. The masked man's grip never loosened, dragging her toward the door with frightening precision. She heard the sound of the key turning in the lock. Her heart pounded in her chest as she realized that her life, as she had known it, was officially over. The door opened with a creak. A rush of cold air hit her face, and she flinched, as though the outside world itself was a threat. Her feet stumbled against the threshold. They were outside now, and her mind screamed for her to run, but her body wouldn't obey. The masked man shoved her forward, urging her down the narrow path that led to a black, unmarked van parked at the end of the driveway. Everything in her screamed to fight back, to scream, to run, but Dr. Ellis was still behind her, his gaze fixed on her every move. There was nowhere to go. The van's doors opened, revealing the dark interior. The air was thick with the smell of something metallic, something wrong. Her breath quickened. The masked man shoved her inside, forcing her into the back seat. Before she could react, the door slammed shut behind her, and the vehicle lurched forward, pulling away from the house. She pressed her back against the cold, hard seat, trying to breathe, trying to understand what was happening. But everything was moving too fast. Dr. Ellis climbed into the van after her, sliding into the seat across from her. He didn't speak. Not immediately. The masked man drove, his face hidden in shadow. The only sound was the low hum of the engine and the muffled beat of her own pulse in her ears. She felt like she was suffocating in the silence, the weight of the situation crushing her chest. It was too much to process. Her mind was racing, but the pieces didn't fit together. Her fingers trembled as she clutched at the seat, trying to steady herself. Dr. Ellis's eyes were cold, calculating, like a predator watching its prey. "You should be grateful," he said, his voice low and almost gentle. "This was the only way for you to truly be free." His words made no sense. Free? How could she be free when she was trapped in a van with two men who had just taken everything from her? Her heart pounded in her chest, the thud deafening. She opened her mouth, but no words came. The world outside blurred as the van sped through empty streets, the headlights illuminating only darkness. She was in a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. "Where are you taking me?" she finally managed to whisper, her voice hoarse. Dr. Ellis smiled, a slow, cruel smile. "Home," he said, like it was the simplest answer in the world. Home? Her stomach twisted. What did he mean by that? She opened her mouth to protest, but the words caught in her throat. She didn't want to know the answer. The van turned a sharp corner, and she felt the vehicle slow, as if they were entering a secluded area. The lights outside flickered as they passed rows of trees, buildings growing more sparse. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. She didn't know where they were going, but it didn't matter. She wasn't leaving. She wasn't going to escape. Dr. Ellis was in control, and she had no choice but to follow wherever he led. The van finally stopped, the engine cutting off with a soft hum. She felt a knot tighten in her stomach. Her pulse thundered in her ears. The door swung open. The masked man was the first one out, stepping into the shadows. Dr. Ellis glanced at her, his eyes unreadable. "Come," he ordered, his voice commanding. She felt like a prisoner in her own skin. Her legs felt like lead as she pushed herself out of the van, her body moving without her consent. She was outside now, standing in the cold night air, surrounded by darkness. There were no lights, no sounds, just the eerie quiet of this unknown place. Dr. Ellis moved toward her, his footsteps steady. "Follow me," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. She didn't want to. She didn't want to follow him anywhere. But she had no choice. Her feet moved, unwillingly, carrying her forward. They walked for what felt like miles, through thick trees, across uneven ground. The silence was suffocating. Finally, they reached a building. A small, dark structure tucked away in the woods. Her heart raced as she realized where they were. A cabin. Isolated. Far from everything. Dr. Ellis didn't hesitate as he pushed open the door. He gestured for her to enter. It was cold inside. The air smelled of dust and something stale. The masked man stepped inside first, standing guard at the door. Dr. Ellis followed her in, closing the door softly behind him. She felt trapped. She was trapped. The walls seemed to close in around her, and as she looked around the small, dimly lit room, the final realization hit her like a punch to the gut. She wasn't going anywhere. This was her new home, and she was never going to escape. The air inside the cabin was thick with tension, heavy with the scent of old wood and dust. The door closed behind her with a soft click, sealing her in. Her breath caught in her throat, her eyes darting around the small, dimly lit space. There were no windows, no exits, just walls. For cold, unforgiving walls. Dr. Ellis moved toward the far corner of the room, his footsteps measured, slow. He was taking his time, savoring every moment of her fear. The masked man stayed near the door, standing rigid, like a silent sentinel. She didn't know how much time had passed since they left the house. Minutes, hours, it felt like an eternity. Her body was numb with disbelief, her mind struggling to process everything that had happened. Charles was dead. The affair, the murder, the police, the van, and now this. She could feel the weight of it all pressing down on her chest, suffocating her. Dr. Ellis turned to face her, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. He looked calm, collected, like this was just another day in his world. She, on the other hand, was falling apart inside. Her heart raced. Her hands trembled. She wanted to scream, to fight, to run, but there was nowhere to go. Nothing she could do. Sit, Dr. Ellis commanded, his voice firm. The words struck her like a whip. She didn't even have to think about it. Her body obeyed. She sank into the chair he had gestured to, the weight of the room bearing down on her. Good, he said, his lips curling into a small, predatory smile. She shivered. She didn't know how to make sense of his calm demeanor, the way he treated everything like a game. And she was the pawn. The realization made her sick to her stomach. Dr. Ellis stepped closer now, his presence looming over her like a shadow. Do you know why you're here? He asked, his voice soft but chilling. She couldn't speak, couldn't even bring herself to look at him. Instead, her eyes roamed the dark corners of the cabin, searching for an escape. But the cabin felt like a tomb. It was just her, him, and the silent figure by the door. Dr. Ellis crouched down in front of her, his face inches from hers. She could feel his breath, cold and calculated against her skin. Her pulse quickened, her hands still trembling. You made a choice, remember, he murmured, his fingers brushing lightly against her cheek. You chose this path. She jerked away, but there was nowhere to hide. No, I didn't, she whispered, shaking her head, her voice cracking. I never meant for any of this. His eyes gleamed with something dark, something twisted. You didn't mean for it, no. But you wanted it. You wanted me. She didn't respond. She couldn't. His gaze never left her. It was like he could see through her, past all her walls, all her defenses. You wanted something more than what you had, he continued, his voice low, almost tender. And now look where we are. She swallowed hard, her throat dry. She couldn't even argue. She had let him in. She had let him take control. Piece by piece, Dr. Ellis stood abruptly, taking a step back, his eyes never leaving her. "Your husband's blood is on your hands," he said, his tone casual, almost nonchalant. The words hit her like a slap. Her eyes stung with unshed tears, but she refused to cry. She couldn't. "You never had the courage to do what was needed," he went on, his voice a mix of pity and something darker. "But I did. I ended the weakness." Her heart shattered as his words echoed in her mind. She didn't want to believe it, didn't want to accept that her actions, her choices, had led her here. But she couldn't deny it. She had let Dr. Ellis into her life. She had let him manipulate her, twist her, until she was nothing but a reflection of his desires. And now, she was trapped in this place, in this world he had created. Dr. Ellis moved again, pacing the room, his fingers lightly tapping against the walls, almost like he was savoring every moment of her suffering. She was silent, her mind reeling. She had been so sure of herself, so sure that she could control the situation, that she could have the best of both worlds. But now, everything was falling apart. The reality of what she had done, and what had been done to her, was finally sinking in. She wasn't just a victim of circumstance. She had made the choice. She had opened the door to this hell. Dr. Ellis stopped in front of her again. This time, his face closer, his expression unreadable. "Do you understand now?" he asked, his voice quiet, almost a whisper. She didn't know how to respond. She wanted to scream, to fight, to beg for her life, for some form of redemption. But the words wouldn't come. Her mouth was dry. Her heart was still hammering in her chest. Dr. Ellis smiled faintly. "I've always known, you know," he said softly. "The moment I met you, I knew we were meant to be. You and me." She shook her head in disbelief. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Why did you do this?" "Because you needed me," he answered simply, his tone almost soothing. "You always have." Her chest tightened. Her mind screamed. No, I didn't need you. I didn't need any of this, But the truth was clear now in the cruel clarity of this moment. She had let herself become a part of this, and there was no going back. The words hung in the air, suffocating her. "You needed me." She felt the weight of them, pressing down on her chest, cutting off her breath. Her eyes locked onto Dr. Ellis, but she couldn't bring herself to say anything. What could she say? The truth was too ugly, too raw. He had orchestrated it all. The affair, the murder, her downfall, and she had willingly played her part, piece by piece. Her fingers clenched into fists at her sides, but there was no strength left in her to fight back. Every part of her was broken, her mind, her soul. And now, her body was just a vessel, a puppet caught in his web. She wanted to run. She wanted to scream, to break free from the chains that bound her. But there was no escape. Not here. Not now. She wanted to turn back time, to undo the choices that had led her to this moment. But it was too late. The door had already closed. Dr. Ellis stepped closer again, his eyes gleaming with something like satisfaction. "You've learned your lesson," he said softly. "The world isn't what you think it is. People are weak. They fall. And they stay down." Her throat tightened. Was he talking about her? Was she just another one of his victims? A broken, discarded thing that he would leave in the corner once he was done with her? The thought made her stomach churn, and she turned her head to the side, unable to look at him anymore. His fingers gently cupped her chin, forcing her to look at him. Her pulse raced in her ears, but she didn't pull away. She couldn't. "Don't look away from me," he murmured. "You need to see the truth." The truth. The truth was that she had already seen it. But the truth was too horrific to face head-on. The blood on her hands. The life she had destroyed. The man she had loved. now gone, lying lifeless on the floor. And the monster she had become by allowing Dr. Ellis into her life. He was right about one thing. People were weak. And she was no different. She had betrayed everything she had once believed in. Her faith, her marriage, her soul. All of it was now a distant memory. "Do you feel it?" he asked, his voice low and intense. The weight of it all. She didn't answer. What was there to say? She could feel the cold creeping into her bones. The guilt, the regret, but mostly she felt numb. Numb to the world. Numb to the man standing before her. Numb to the horrific reality of her choices. He let go of her chin and stepped back, his eyes never leaving hers. "There's no going back," he said softly, almost kindly. "You understand that, don't you?" She nodded once, slowly, though her mind screamed against it. She didn't want to understand. She didn't want to accept that her life had become this twisted thing. But the truth was clear and she couldn't deny it any longer. She was his. And there was no escape. Dr. Ellis turned toward the masked man, who had been standing motionless by the door, waiting like a silent sentinel. "Get the rest of the supplies," Dr. Ellis ordered, his voice calm, like they were merely preparing for a simple task. The masked man nodded and moved toward a small cabinet in the corner of the room. She didn't know what he was getting and she didn't want to know. Her heart skipped a beat as Dr. Ellis turned back toward her. "There's still much to be done," he said, his tone almost affectionate. "You'll learn in time." Learn? Learn what? She couldn't comprehend it. The door was locked. She was trapped. There was no escape, no rescue. Just him. Always him. The masked man returned to Dr. Ellis's side, his arms filled with dark tools, things that made her stomach churn just from the sight of them. She wanted to scream, to beg for mercy, but she had no voice. She had no strength. Her fate had already been sealed the moment she made her first choice. Dr. Ellis walked toward her slowly, the weight of his presence filling the room. She felt like a cornered animal, her breathing shallow, her pulse erratic. The silence stretched between them, suffocating. And then, in a voice that was almost gentle, he said, "It's time to make you mine." Her heart slammed against her chest as fear and panic surged through her. No, she thought. Not again. She wanted to fight. She wanted to scream. But all she could do was stare at him, paralyzed by the overwhelming realization that her life was no longer her own. She was trapped, and the nightmare was only just beginning. The words echoed in her mind, louder than her own heartbeat. "Make you mine." Her body stiffened. Every fiber in her being screamed for escape. But her limbs were frozen, her mind in a fog. Dr. Ellis approached slowly, his eyes never leaving her. Each step he took felt like the pounding of a drum in her ears. The masked man stood to the side, watching, waiting. His movements were mechanical, almost like he was part of the room itself, silent, motionless. The coldness in the air thickened, as though the room had dropped several degrees. She could feel her breath quickening, her chest tightening with each passing second. Her mouth was dry, but she couldn't swallow. Dr. Ellis reached out, his fingers trailing lightly along the edge of her cheek, his touch almost tender. But it wasn't gentle. It wasn't kind. It was a command, a demand, and she was powerless to stop it. "You're so beautiful," he murmured, his voice low, almost seductive, like he was savoring the moment. His hand slid lower, to her neck, then down to her shoulder. She recoiled, her mind a blur of panic and disbelief. She wanted to scream, to tell him to stop, but her voice was trapped inside her throat, choked by the weight of fear and helplessness. Dr. Ellis leaned in closer, his breath hot against her ear. "I told you," he whispered. "You were never meant to be free." The words slithered into her mind, coiling around her like a snake. She had made her choices. She had allowed this man into her life. She had let him control her every move. And now, here she was, trapped in the very nightmare she had helped to create. The weight of it all settled over her like a suffocating blanket. Dr. Ellis pulled back slightly, his gaze still locked on hers. "You see," he said, almost conversationally, "you were never truly in control. Not then. Not now." The masked man took a step forward, his eyes cold and emotionless, like he was nothing more than a shadow. Her eyes flicked between them, her heart hammering in her chest. "What do you want from me?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Dr. Ellis smiled, slow, deliberate, as though he had been waiting for her to ask. "I want you to understand, finally, that you're mine," he said, his voice smooth, almost comforting, like he was explaining something simple. "You always have been." Her stomach lurched. She felt bile rise in her throat. The walls of the room seemed to close in on her. No escape. No way out. His words dug deeper into her skin, into her soul. The truth was impossible to ignore now. She had walked into this trap willingly. She had let him in, let him twist her desires, her needs, until all that was left was a hollow shell. "I will make you understand," Dr. Ellis continued, his hand moving from her shoulder to her chin, tilting her face up to meet his eyes. "You'll be more than just mine. You'll be part of something greater, something you can't even comprehend yet." The terror in her chest swelled. She wanted to scream, but the words caught in her throat. What was he going to do to her? "Don't worry," he added, as if reading her thoughts. "This is just the beginning." Her pulse raced as he stepped back, pacing the room like a predator circling its prey. She could feel the ground beneath her shaking, the cold creeping through her skin, settling deep in her bones. But then there was a soft rustling sound, a subtle movement in the corner of the room. Her eyes snapped to it. The masked man had shifted, and in his hands, he was holding something, a long, gleaming object. Her heart stopped. A knife. No. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. Dr. Ellis turned toward the masked man, his eyes glinting with anticipation. "Not yet," he said, his voice almost disappointed. "We need to be patient." The knife was lowered, and the masked man stepped back, as if waiting for a signal. Dr. Ellis didn't look at her. His attention was fixed entirely on the masked figure, like she wasn't even in the room anymore. But she was trapped in this nightmare, her heart racing, her mind reeling. "Do you understand?" Dr. Ellis asked, his voice soft again, almost tender. "You'll never leave this place. This is your life now. You belong to me." Her head swam with his words. She could still hear the sound of her heartbeat in her ears. The thrum of it was almost deafening. Belong to him. It was a truth she had never wanted to face. And now it was all too clear. She was his. No one would ever save her. She had become part of his twisted world. A world where the only rule was submission. The weight of that realization pressed down on her chest like a vice, squeezing the last remnants of resistance from her body. She was nothing now. Nothing but a possession. A prize to be claimed. The masked man stood motionless, knife still in hand, waiting for Dr. Ellis's command. But she knew it didn't matter. She didn't matter. The game was over, and she had lost. The silence in the cabin thickened, suffocating her. Her breath came in short, shallow gasps, her chest rising and falling erratically. Dr. Ellis had not moved, not even a muscle. His eyes were still locked on her, like he was savoring every moment of her fear. The masked man, standing at attention, held the knife with a quiet precision, the blade gleaming faintly in the dim light. It seemed to glow with a sickly promise of what was to come. She could feel her body trembling, betraying her desire to fight back, to flee. But there was nowhere to run. Nowhere to hide. She was trapped. Completely. Her hands were clenched so tightly at her sides that her nails dug into her palms. But it didn't matter. She was already bound by 1,000 invisible chains, each one tighter than the last. Dr. Ellis leaned in closer, his face a mere inch from hers. Her skin crawled under his gaze. "I told you this was inevitable," he murmured softly, his lips brushing her ear. "You can fight it, or you can accept it." She swallowed hard, forcing the words out. "Why? Why are you doing this?" Dr. Ellis's laugh was low, rich with the satisfaction of someone who knew they had complete control. "It's not about why," he said, straightening up. "It's about what. And what you are now is mine." Her stomach twisted into knots. She wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. Her throat was tight, her chest suffocating under the weight of his words. She could hear the masked man moving behind her, his footsteps barely audible on the creaky wooden floor. Asterisk, please, no. Please don't let this happen, asterisk. But her body was frozen in place. She was powerless. She could feel his presence, the closeness of the masked man, his cold, silent presence pressed in on her from every angle. "You don't get to ask why," Dr. Ellis continued, his voice suddenly cold. "You just get to accept it." She tried to pull away, but her body wouldn't obey. She was stuck, trapped in the web he had spun, and now there was no escape. The masked man stepped forward, his shadow looming over her. She didn't need to see his face to know the look in his eyes. The emptiness, the coldness. Her breath hitched in her throat as the man came to stand beside her. His gloved hand hovered just above her shoulder, almost like a warning. Dr. Ellis was still watching, still waiting, as if this was all some sick game. "I've given you a chance," he said, his tone almost casual, as if the gravity of the situation meant nothing to him. "A chance to make a choice. You've had plenty of time to make your decision." Her mind was spinning, her thoughts a blur. She had made so many choices in the past, some good, some terrible. But this was beyond her control. "Please don't." Her voice was barely above a whisper, her body trembling uncontrollably. Dr. Ellis smirked, like he was about to deliver a punchline to a joke she had never heard. "But you see, that's the thing, my dear," he said softly, his voice dripping with condescension. "You never really had a choice. Not in the end." Her breath caught in her throat, and for the first time since they had arrived at the cabin, her eyes darted desperately toward the door. Could she make a run for it? The realization hit her too late. She had no strength left, no will. The door was locked. She was already deep inside the nightmare. And now there was no escape. The masked man reached forward with cold, mechanical precision, grabbing her arm and yanking her out of the chair. Her legs buckled beneath her. She couldn't stand. She couldn't move. "Get up," the masked man growled, his voice muffled beneath the mask. Dr. Ellis simply watched, his expression unreadable, like he was waiting for something, for her to break, for her to surrender. And deep inside, she felt something snap. Her mind screamed for her to do something, anything, to fight back. But her body wouldn't cooperate. She was nothing more than a puppet, hanging by strings that Dr. Ellis had pulled tight. She was lost. How did I get here? But even that question felt irrelevant now. It didn't matter how she got here. It only mattered that she was here. With them. The masked man dragged her toward the far side of the room. She could feel the floor beneath her feet, rough and uneven, but her body was numb. Her mind was frozen in place. Dr. Ellis moved behind her, his footsteps soft on the wooden floor, but she could feel his presence, closing in on her, suffocating her. His voice was a mere whisper now, meant for only her ears. "I've always known you were special," he said softly. "You've always been the one. My perfect creation. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she tried to speak, to argue, but the words were lost. The masked man stopped in front of a table, its surface cluttered with sharp instruments, things that gleamed in the dim light. She recognized the gleam in their edges. Tools of pain, tools of submission. A shiver ran down her spine. "Get on the table," Dr. Ellis ordered, his voice a low command. Her heart sank. The finality of it crushed her. There was no room left for hope. No escape. The masked man forced her onto the table. She didn't resist. She couldn't. Her pulse raced, her breathing coming in frantic gasps. Her mind was numb, trapped in a cycle of fear, unable to break free. The cold steel of the table pressed into her back, sending a shiver through her body. "Just relax," Dr. Ellis cooed from above, his fingers lightly tracing along her arm. "It'll be over before you know it." Her mind raced, but there was no escape. And this was the end. The chill of the metal table beneath her skin seemed to seep through her veins, numbing her, pulling her deeper into a place she couldn't escape. The darkness in the room seemed to thicken with every second that passed. Her breathing was shallow, her chest tight with panic. She tried to move, to push against the restraints, but her body felt heavy, as though all the strength had drained out of her. Her mind, though still screaming, felt distant now, faint. Dr. Ellis's voice broke through the fog, smooth and cold, like the steel surrounding her. "You've already given yourself to me," he whispered, his fingers brushing her neck. "Your choices were made long ago. You just never realized it." The words hit her like a slap. She had been a fool. She had thought she could control it, thought she could walk away when things got too dark. But now the truth was unavoidable. She had already chosen, and now there was no turning back. Dr. Ellis moved away, his footsteps light but purposeful, as if he had all the time in the world. The masked man loomed near the table, silent, motionless. His presence felt suffocating, as if every inch of the room was filled with his cold, emotionless gaze. She could feel her body tremble involuntarily, her limbs reacting to the terror coiling deep within her gut. Dr. Ellis returned, a soft metallic click from his hand as he picked up something from the table. Her eyes flitted to it, sharp, jagged, gleaming in the dim light. A scalpel. Her heart skipped a beat, but she couldn't look away. She couldn't tear her eyes from it. It was as though the very sight of the blade paralyzed her. "Don't be afraid," Dr. Ellis whispered, though the tone of his voice told her the opposite. His eyes gleamed with something far darker. "It will hurt, but only for a moment, and then it will be over." She felt bile rise in her throat. She wanted to scream, but her throat was dry, her voice lost. She wanted to beg, but the words wouldn't form. Dr. Ellis hovered over her, the scalpel in his hand gleaming with a quiet promise. "You'll see," he murmured. "This is what happens when you choose to step into my world." The cold touch of the blade against her skin sent a shock through her body, a wave of pure terror that ripped through every nerve. She gasped, her body jerking instinctively, but the masked man held her down, his hands pressing hard against her shoulders, immobilizing her with the force of someone who had done this many times before. Dr. Ellis's eyes were locked on hers as he slowly, carefully, began to trace the blade along the line of her arm. The cold steel felt like fire against her skin, and a gasp of pain tore from her throat. She tried to push the thought away, tried to shut out the reality of what was happening, but it was impossible. The pain, the terror, it was too real. And the worst part was she couldn't do anything to stop it. The room spun around her, the world tilting into darkness. "You see," Dr. Ellis continued, his voice soft and unhurried, "you were never meant to be free. You never wanted freedom. Not really. You wanted to be taken. You wanted to be consumed by something bigger. And now here we are. Her heart pounded, her head spinning as the blade moved deeper, more deliberate now, carving a path that felt like it would never end. Asterisk no asterisk. She finally managed to scream, but the sound was so weak, so small, swallowed up by the overwhelming presence of Dr. Ellis and his mask-wearing accomplice. Her limbs shook uncontrollably, tears spilling down her face, but they didn't stop. They couldn't stop. Dr. Ellis paused for a moment, leaning down until his face was inches from hers. His smile was cold, cruel. "You still don't understand," he said quietly, almost like a whisper. "It's not about your pain. It's about your surrender. And you've already surrendered." Her eyes blurred with tears, her chest tight with fear. The truth was crushing her. She had never been in control. Not from the moment she stepped into his office. Not from the moment their affair began. She had played right into his hands. Dr. Ellis moved again, his fingers tracing her face, his gaze never leaving hers. The scalpel was still in his other hand, poised as if it was just another tool in his repertoire. And she was nothing but an object, a possession, a broken, empty thing for him to manipulate and shape at his will. "Just remember," Dr. Ellis said softly, his voice almost soothing, "you asked for this. Every time you let me into your life. Every time you trusted me." He bent closer, his lips brushing against her ear, his words sending a chill down her spine. "You wanted this. You begged for it. And now—" He paused, his breath cold against her skin. "Now it's mine." Her mind screamed for an escape, for a way out, but there was none. No one was coming. No one could save her now. She was trapped. And in that moment, a crushing realization settled in her chest. Her life, her soul, her very existence. All of it had already been claimed, and there was no one left to stop it. The sound of the masked man's footsteps grew louder as he approached, his every step echoing in her mind. Her breath hitched, but she couldn't move. She couldn't run. The fear, the helplessness, it paralyzed her. The mask-wearing figure didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to send a fresh wave of terror through her veins. Dr. Ellis stood by, watching intently, like an artist admiring his work. Her blood, still warm and slick against her skin, seemed to pulse with each beat of her heart. It was a grim reminder of what she had become, a canvas for their twisted designs. The masked man held something in his gloved hands now, a long, thin needle. It gleamed in the low light like a terrible promise. Her chest tightened. Asterisk no. Asterisk. Her pulse raced. She tried to look away, to turn her head, but it was impossible. She was trapped. "You know," Dr. Ellis's voice broke through the heavy silence, "this next step is crucial. It's about total transformation, total surrender." Her heart pounded in her chest, her whole body trembling. She couldn't bear it, but the needle was already moving closer, the masked man's gloved hand steady as he approached her. "You'll feel this," Dr. Ellis continued, his voice almost clinical, detached from the reality of what was happening. "But you won't be able to stop it. Not anymore." The needle hovered above her skin, and her entire body screamed in protest, but her lips couldn't form the words to beg. Her mind screamed louder than her mouth ever could. She wanted to fight back, but the moment had passed. There was no strength left in her, no defiance. Asterisk, I'm nothing. Nothing at all, asterisk. The needle was pressed against her arm. The cold metal stung like ice. A sharp pain flared as the needle pierced her skin, the pressure of it sending a wave of panic through her. Her body jerked, but the masked man didn't flinch. His grip was firm, holding her steady as he pushed the needle deeper. It felt like it was going straight through her veins, a cold, lifeless thing injecting itself into her very soul. You won't be the same after this, Dr. Ellis murmured, his voice rich with dark satisfaction. You'll belong to me completely. She could feel the drug coursing through her veins. Her thoughts began to slow, each one sliding into the next with a kind of disorienting fluidity. Her limbs went limp, her body sinking deeper into the cold table, into the suffocating reality of it all. Her thoughts were growing foggy, distant. The panic she had felt was fading, slipping away into a strange, hollow calmness. The masked man stepped back, his work finished for now. He didn't speak, didn't acknowledge her at all. He simply faded into the background, like a shadow waiting for his next move. Dr. Ellis, however, was still watching her. You feel it, don't you? He whispered, his voice warm and almost affectionate. The peace, the acceptance. You finally stopped fighting. Her body was no longer her own. The drug was doing its work, pulling her under, numbing her, erasing her ability to resist. Her thoughts began to blur. She couldn't focus. She couldn't remember where she was or how she got here. The world was slipping from her grasp, and she didn't care anymore. It was easier this way, wasn't it? To give in, to let go. It didn't matter. Nothing mattered. Dr. Ellis leaned down, his breath hot against her ear. You're mine now, he whispered, his words lingering in her mind, twisting and curling into her very core. You'll never escape. Not now. Not ever. Her chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, her heartbeat slow and steady now, like a drumbeat in the distance. She was fading, fading into the abyss. The mask-wearing figure moved again, taking a place by the door, his silhouette a dark figure against the dim light. She barely registered it. Rest now, Dr. Ellis cooed, his voice softer now, soothing, like a lullaby. You'll feel better soon. The transition will be smooth. But even as he spoke those words, something stirred deep within her. A tiny ember, a flicker of defiance. It was so small, barely a spark in the overwhelming darkness. But it was there, and as her mind drifted into the fog of the drug, she couldn't help but hold onto that tiny flicker. It wasn't much, but it was something that could still burn. The drug began to lull her deeper, its cold tendrils slipping through her veins like ice. But even in the haze, that small ember inside her still flickered. It wasn't much, barely noticeable, but it was there, clinging to life. Her pulse, now slow and steady, felt distant, as if her body no longer belonged to her. She was losing herself, but that small spark, that tiny, desperate flicker, refused to be snuffed out completely. She could hear Dr. Ellis's voice, soft and soothing, but it sounded distant now, like it was coming from a long, dark tunnel. You're so close now, he whispered, his fingers lightly grazing her face. So close to everything you've always needed. Her breath was shallow, her chest heavy with the weight of the drug in her system. But a fragment of her mind screamed, no. This isn't me. This isn't who I am, But the rest of her broken, beaten body, was so tired, so empty. You'll forget everything soon, Dr. Ellis continued, almost tenderly, as if coaxing a child into sleep. Everything but me. Everything but us. The words wrapped around her mind, tightening, squeezing out any remaining resistance. Her eyes fluttered, her vision dimming, but she could still see him, hovering above her, his eyes shining with dark triumph. You belong to me now, he said, as if reminding her of a simple fact, and I will never let you go. For a moment, the room seemed to tilt, the air thick with the overwhelming pressure of the moment. Her vision swam, then sharpened as though something was stirring beneath the drug-induced fog. A flicker of clarity. No, I won't let this happen. I can't. The ember inside her sparked again, brighter now, pushing against the suffocating numbness that surrounded her. Her heart, though weak, thudded loudly in her chest, like a drumbeat of rebellion. For the first time, she became aware of the restraints again, the cold, metallic bands holding her wrists and ankles to the table. She could feel the sharpness of them cutting into her skin, but it wasn't just pain now. It was a lifeline. The ember was growing. A flame, small but desperate, flickered in the depths of her mind. I'm not gone yet. Her muscles, though heavy, still obeyed. However sluggishly, she forced herself to move, just the smallest twitch of her fingers. It felt like trying to move through molasses, but she didn't stop. Move. Her fingers twitched again, more forcefully now. And though her limbs felt as though they were made of stone, she felt the restraints loosen ever so slightly. Dr. Ellis didn't notice. He was too caught up in his own satisfaction, too engrossed in the control he thought he had over her. You're mine, he repeated, as if it was an incantation. The masked man in the corner didn't speak. He simply stood, his unblinking gaze fixed on her. But something about him felt off, different. A sudden flash of something, an idea, a memory, hit her. She wasn't alone. A small, almost imperceptible noise from the corner of the room drew her attention. A shift, a movement. The masked man wasn't alone. A small noise, barely audible, came from a dark corner, near the window. And there, emerging from the shadows, was a figure. A man, tall, broad-shouldered, but his face was hidden beneath a cap and dark sunglasses. He moved with purpose, not making a sound, and his presence seemed to cut through the tension in the room like a knife. She didn't know him. She couldn't see his face clearly, but something about him felt different. His sudden appearance sent a jolt of adrenaline rushing through her veins. He wasn't here to hurt her. He was here to help. Her heart skipped a beat, the ember of hope flaring up suddenly, bursting to life. Her fingers twitched again, this time with more force. The restraints, still tight, began to shift ever so slightly. The masked man glanced up, sensing something was wrong. He moved toward her with a slow, deliberate pace, his hand reaching for the instruments on the table. But the new man in the shadows stepped forward. The tension in the room thickened. The figure from the shadows spoke, his voice calm but firm. Step away from her, he said, his tone full of authority. She's not yours to claim anymore. The words sent a shiver down her spine. It was the first time anyone had spoken like this in what felt like an eternity. Dr. Ellis turned slowly, his face twisting in confusion. Who the hell are you? He sneered. The stranger didn't flinch. His eyes were cold, calculating, and utterly focused on the task at hand. I'm her way out, he said quietly. The masked man moved forward, but the stranger was faster. In a flash, he grabbed him by the wrist and twisted it, forcing the man to drop the scalpel. Dr. Ellis's eyes widened in disbelief. Who do you think you are? He spat, stepping back in fury. The stranger didn't answer. Instead, he moved toward her, his gaze shifting from her tear-streaked face to the restraints binding her. The ember of hope inside her burned brighter. The moment had arrived. The stranger was here, and now she had a chance. Her hand twitched once more, and the restraint snapped free. And with that, the fight was on. The stranger's hands moved with swift, practiced efficiency, unlocking the restraints that had held her for what felt like an eternity. With each click of the metal, the fog in her mind began to lift. The drug's hold on her was weakening, and the ember inside her grew stronger. Her arms were free. Dr. Ellis froze, his eyes widening as the reality of the situation hit him. The masked man, still clutching his wrist, glared at the newcomer, but the stranger didn't give him a chance to retaliate. Without a word, he spun toward her, offering a hand, an anchor in the chaos. Her heart hammered in her chest, but now it wasn't out of fear. It was adrenaline. Hope. She took his hand, her fingers trembling, not just from weakness, but from the sudden surge of life filling her veins. "Come on," the stranger whispered, pulling her up. "We don't have much time." Her legs were unsteady, but she managed to stand, her body still heavy and sluggish, as though waking from a long nightmare. The room felt both distant and immediate, like she was seeing it for the first time, the shadows pressing in from every corner. Dr. Ellis's voice broke the silence, low and dangerous. "You think you can just walk away from me?" he snarled, his face twisting in fury. The masked man finally freed his wrist, stepping back with a deadly calm. He reached for the scalpel on the floor, his eyes never leaving the stranger. The stranger didn't flinch, his grip on her tightened, and for the first time, she realized he was not just here to rescue her. He was here to fight. "Not today," he said, his voice hard, like stone. With a swift movement, he pulled her away, stepping between her and Dr. Ellis. His hand shot out, grabbing a heavy object from the table. Dr. Ellis's eyes flared in anger, his hand reaching for something, anything, to control the situation. But the stranger was already moving, positioning himself between them, blocking any attempt to reach her. The fight was inevitable. "Run," the stranger barked, and with that, she turned, her legs shaking but determined. She ran, each step a victory, each breath a chance at life. Behind her, she could hear the clash of metal, the shouts, the struggle. But she didn't look back. She didn't need to. She was free. She had escaped. As they burst through the door into the cold night, she finally allowed herself to breathe. For the first time in a long time, she felt the weight of her own body, the truth of her freedom, and she knew, deep down, she had survived. And she would never look back. The cold air hit her like a wave as they stepped outside. The night was dark, the sky overcast with clouds, but the city lights flickered in the distance like beacons of hope. For a moment, she couldn't move, her breath ragged and shallow, her heart pounding like a drum in her chest. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on her, heavy and suffocating. But the stranger's grip on her arm remained steady. His presence was unwavering, strong, comforting, in a way she hadn't felt in so long. "Are you okay?" His voice was soft but urgent, eyes scanning her face, searching for any sign of injury. She nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. The world felt so strange now. The nightmare, the darkness, it was fading, slipping away with every breath she took. But the reality of it still lingered like a shadow at the edges of her mind. "You're safe now," he said, his words a promise. "You're not going back there. I won't let that happen." Her gaze flickered to him, her mind racing. Who was he? Why was he there? And how did he know? But there were no answers to these questions right now. She didn't need them. All that mattered was that she was free. The adrenaline that had carried her this far began to fade, and the exhaustion hit her like a wave. Her legs wobbled, and she leaned against him, feeling the warmth of his body against hers. "We need to keep moving," he said, pulling her gently but firmly toward a nearby alley. She stumbled, but he was there to catch her, and together, they moved through the darkness, away from the place that had once held her captive. Each step felt like a small victory, a defiance of everything she had endured. The world still felt foreign, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like it was hers to reclaim. As they reached the end of the alley, a car pulled up, its headlights cutting through the night. The door opened, and a man's voice called out to them. "Get in," the voice urged. "We don't have much time." Without hesitation, the stranger nodded, helping her into the car. She collapsed into the back seat, her body heavy with the weight of what had happened and what was still to come. The car sped off into the night, the city receding behind them. For the first time in years, she felt the flicker of something inside her, a fragile but undeniable sense of peace. She was free, and she would never let anyone take that from her again.